I am indeed very honored to be here to speak at the Warburg, which has over many years played such an important role in facilitating the research of numerous scholars in subjects related to magic and the occult, and interestingly enough also magic and occult in Islam. To proceed, numerous studies have been devoted to magic and the occult in Western civilization. However, the systematic scholarly study of magic and occult in Islamic civilization remains in its infancy. Perhaps the most well-known work and the most widely circulated work in this regard is an anthology of articles entitled Magic and Divination in Early Islam, edited by Emily Savage Smith. Other than that, much of the work has been done by anthropologists, which tend to have deemed this occult phenomenon in Islamic civilization to be merely of a folkloric or popular character. And oftentimes the anthropologists who have done these kinds of studies have not been adequate to the job, to put it very bluntly, in terms of truly understanding the significance of the phenomenon that they have examined. So magic and the occult were far from being a subterranean phenomenon or merely an aspect of the popular culture and folklore of Islamicate or of Islamic civilization. Indeed, they were far more central to Islamic civilization than has been heretofore realized or even acknowledged, even though they were somewhat hidden, for after all, that is what occult means. It was the detailed knowledge of what I like to call these esoteric technologies, especially the making of talismans and associated things, that remained relatively hidden from non-initiates. But there was nevertheless quite a widespread awareness of the occult sciences in Islamic civilization, and continues to a certain extent. And it was an unquestioned assumption of Islamic society that magic and the occult were real. And that remains very, very true for most so-called practicing Muslims, and even rather lax Muslims as well, who may not be very practicing. But when we speak of magic and the occult in Islam, a very important distinction must be drawn between magic, which in Arabic is called sihrun, and what we can call, for want of a better term, non-magic. So magic and non-magic. The practice of magic, again, what in Arabic is called sihrun, along with the magician, the sahir, the sorcerer, are both universally condemned by scholars of the Sharia, the sacred law of Islam, as being completely forbidden. However, we often come across the idea that the study of sihr or magic is permitted, but not its practice. Why? Well, to protect yourself from magical attack, obviously. As for non-magic, by this I mean all the occult sciences which do not resort to demonic means. To elaborate, Muslim scholars have always distinguished between the infernal resort to supernatural means, which is characterized again by the term sihrun in Arabic, and is referred to, of course, by the English term magic, and the supernal or celestial resort to supernatural means based on the ritual use of the Quran and the divine names, thus non-magic. Now, I will deal with some elements of these ritual uses in due course. At the moment, I simply wish to make a very clear distinction between such rituals and magic, and for which I have coined a new term which I'm trying to popularize, which is Quranic theurgy. May or may not be acceptable to everyone, but this is my attempt. Of course, the term theurgy is obviously of Greek origin, but it's unusually well suited to our context, inasmuch as in original Arabic texts we often come across the word amal for such activities, such workings, if you like. And the term theurgy certainly conveys this sense of God work, or God working, if you like. In addition to Quranic theurgy, by the term non-magic, I also have in mind, or what I would characterize as the subsidiary occult sciences in Islamic civilization, of astronomy, astrology, and of course they did not distinguish between the two. Typically, there were various terms used in Arabic. We won't go into all of those. There would also be, of course, the royal art of alchemy, the science of sand, as literally translated, ilm al-raml, or the science of geomancy. And finally, the most quintessentially Islamic of the occult sciences, ilm al-jafr, which really can't translate into English in terms of a one-word translation. I would characterize it as the science of the symbolism of the Arabic letters in all of their dimensions. In other words, their idiophonic dimension of the oral with an O and oral with an AU symbolism, ideographic, visual symbolism, and arithmological dimensions as well, a kind of mathematical symbolism, numerical symbolism. This science of ilm al-jafr is the very pith and marrow of Quranic theurgy, as well as being thoroughly integrated with all of the aforementioned subsidiary occult sciences. The premier practitioner and theorist of this Quranic theurgy is our man Ahmad ibn Ali al-Buni. And for him, this theurgy is certainly not magic, and he is certainly not a magician. And we continually come across him being described as a magician and a practitioner of magic. So, for example, one of the famous scholars who has written about al-Buni is someone named, a very eminent scholar. I respect him very, very deeply. I've met him. I've communicated to him my concerns. Professor Jan Just Whitcomb of Leiden. Also, one of his papers refers to him in the very title as the Egyptian magician al-Buni. Noah Gardner, a young and upcoming scholar, also uses magician, magic, etc., etc. But al-Buni is not a magician in the sense that he is not practicing sihr. On the contrary, his theurgy is an hieratic art, an occult technology, if you like, based on the divine names. That is to say, on the characteristically Sufi practice of the intense invocation of the names of Allah, the names of God in Islam. Magic, sihrun, on the other hand, involves the pressing into service or even direct invocation of infernal beings, of demons, typically, whose domain is the sublunary realm. It is thus that I propose that instead of magic and magician, we employ theurgy and theurgist instead. As for the practice of magic, we may revive the terms goeti, goetic, goetia, which again is a word used in English but of Greek origin, coming from a word in Greek which, correct me Charles if I err in this regard, I'm not an expert on Greek, literally meaning to wail or to cry. And according to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, was used in English to mean witchcraft or magic, performed by the invocation and employment of evil spirits, necromancy. My understanding also is that the late Platonist Iamblichus, about the 4th century of the Common Era, made much of this distinction between theurgy and goetia in a famous treatise he wrote on the theurgy of the ancient Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Greeks. And it's also my understanding, and there are eminent experts on this field here, so please, I beg your indulgence if I have erred. It is also my understanding that the Renaissance Platonist Pico della Mirandola also upheld such a distinction in his works. At any rate, the use of such terms in the context of cognate phenomena in Islamic culture is, in my view, eminently reasonable. While such practices of Quranic theurgy do not begin with al-Buni, and indeed, I would argue, and it's beyond the scope of this public lecture to go into this, but I would argue that their first appearance in Islamic history is in certain teachings of the Shiite Imams. And while al-Buni was not a Shiite, he is, to my knowledge, the most prolific writer on this subject. And all of the works collectively designated by specialists on al-Buni as the Corpus Bunyanum are concerned with this topic of the divine names, Quranic, what I call Quranic theurgy. Now, who was al-Buni? Unfortunately, we don't know much about him. The biographical details are very scant, and this is in contradistinction to his much more famous contemporary Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, about whom we have a great deal of information. But al-Buni, we don't have a lot of information. All we really know is that he was supposedly born, and almost everything we say about his biography has to have a bit of a question mark. Supposedly he was born in a place called Buna, which is the present-day Annaba in Algeria, northeastern coastal Algeria. In fact, he flourished in Egypt and allegedly, hence the question mark, died in 622 of the Hijrah, 1225, excuse me, of the Common Era. That's very strange, considering the considerable fame he enjoys today, that he wouldn't have left much of a trace in the biographical dictionaries. Muslims were obsessed with writing biographical dictionaries, and we don't really find much about him. So maybe he just kept a very low profile, but if he was very famous in his lifetime, we tend to have good death dates for famous people, because especially a Sufi master like that would have had a well-attended funeral and presumably would have been recorded in the sources. At any rate, he may well have just kept a very low profile, and his fame is a posthumous development. Oddly enough, no trace of his seems to remain of his tomb in Cairo either, and it seems to have sort of been effaced as early as maybe the 8th or 9th century of the Hijrah, because there's a Sufi sort of prayer grave visitation manual written by someone named Ibn Sayyad that even mentions that there was really no tomb, but they sort of knew where it was. So the vast Islamic necropolis of Cairo swallowed it up. What we do know, what is very interesting about al-Buni though, is that there is evidence that he and Muhyiddin ibn Arabi shared a common spiritual master. And this is someone named Abdulaziz al-Mahdawi. And there is evidence for this in the manuscripts. I first came across evidence of this in 2 manuscripts in March 2011, but Noah Gardner published in January 2012 this information, and he had more sources. But at any rate, excuse me. So regardless of what death date we give more weight to, it seems that there was this common spiritual master, but we can't really say if there was influence. We just don't know. The question remains open. But what we can say with certainty is that al-Buni authored a number of works of theurgic praxis on the divine names, which are extremely important. And of course, one of these is Shams al-Ma'arif, which translates as the sun of knowledge. There is a great deal of controversy about the exact relationship of this book to al-Buni in the manuscripts. I have written about this at length in a paper which hopefully will be published soon, and we cannot go into it in this lecture. Another work which is of great importance is Lata'if al-Isharat, which is something like the subtle indications or something like that. And another book entitled Alam al-Huda, or the banner or the standard or the signpost of guidance, although Noah Gardner in his paper, wrongly in my opinion, reads this as Ilm al-Huda, which makes it the science of guidance, and anyway, that is my opinion. This text, the Shams al-Ma'arif, continues to be the text of choice for modern occultists in the contemporary Muslim world. And I have seen translations in Urdu, modern Turkish, and Indonesian, and I'm sure others exist, but I've seen those for sure. And it held and continues to hold pride of place in Islamic occultism, much more so than the Picatrix, the Ghayat al-Hakim, which is obviously a text with which scholars of Western esotericism are very, very interested, and rightly so. And of course, the edition was published here at the Warburg and so forth. But this text is almost unknown among Muslim contemporary, practitioners of the occult sciences, and I think it represents a different sort of, its own Picatrixian tradition, if you like. So my analysis of al-Buni is based on a number of manuscripts which I have been studying since about 2011. I have about 15 manuscripts mainly from library collections in Istanbul, and one which I, quite by accident, found the Bodleian in Oxford. And so I will not bore you anymore with these details of manuscripts and their relationship to al-Buni. But I must say just one thing. There is since we're going to be talking about the Shams al-Ma'arif, the Sun of Knowledge, there is this idea that there were 3 recensions of the book. And those of you who are interested in this topic will probably know this. A longer, a shorter, and a middle version. I don't think this is justified, and there are many reasons for this. What I have concluded is that there were 2 versions, a long version and a short version. And what is called, the other version, which is sometimes confused as being the short version or the middle version, is in fact another book, which is in fact the Lataif al-Isharat. What are these books about? Lataif al-Isharat. Okay? So these 3 books are extremely important. Why? What do they say? The Shams al-Ma'arif, the Sun of Knowledge, and the other book, the Subtle Illusions, is a manual. It's not really a cookbook, though, but it is a kind of manual of this occult theurgic praxis of the divine names. And the 3rd book, the Alam al-Huda, or the standard, the banner, the signpost of guidance, is a kind of theoretical work about the divine names. This notion of the divine names and the invocation of the divine names is very well known to anyone who has even the slightest acquaintance with Islam or who has studied about Sufism. That's what Sufis do. It's the invocation of the divine name. But with a figure like al-Buni, it's more than just that. And in this, he sort of shares the same idea with Ibn al-Arabi, that if you invoke the divine names enough, and if you become spiritual and pious enough, you acquire a certain power. But this power is through divine support, rather than resort to demonic aids and familiars and whatnot. And of course, if you go far enough, you attain very close to the station of the perfect man, the station of the Qutb, the axial saint around which the entire cosmos revolves. And there's a marvelous phrase in a book about Ibn Arabi by, although it uses the term magical, but it's still very nice, by Izutsu. In his chapter, he has a study on Sufism called Sufism and Taoism. He has a chapter called The Magical Power of the Perfect Man. What he is referring to is an idea which is expressed in detail in Ibn al-Arabi. And it seems that you find the implementation, the how to bring it about in al-Buni. I say seems, but Ibn al-Arabi in his Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, which I have just finished a critical edition of, talks about how the al-insan al-kamil, or the perfect man, the person who brings about this proximity to God through the invocation of the divine names, acquires the power of tasarruf, the power to actually affect what happens in the cosmos through, if you like, prayer, through the invocation of certain formulae, certain divine names. So, to give you a specific example of this kind of theurgy or theurgic practice, the most conspicuous example of this would be what I would call this occult technology of talismans. The use of talismans is quite popular even to this day in the Islamic world. And again, it's not just, and it wasn't just in the past also, a folkloric phenomenon or a phenomenon of associated just with popular culture and the lower uneducated classes. The use of talismans was widespread in all strata of Islamic society. There have also been a number of studies by Cornel Fleischer and his school. He has a number of followers that have examined figures and events that bear a intimate connection with al-Buni, and how, in particular, how theurgists who came after al-Buni were sometimes associated with important rulers and who resorted to their knowledge and their services, if you like, to further perpetuate and propagate their own political power. Mind you, that still happens today. I don't know about the Western democracies, but in the, for example, in Pakistan, in India, also in Arab countries, a lot of these rulers and potentates and princes have sort of their personal amil, their personal expert on these matters, who is writing them talismans and doing various other operations to secure their rule and their position on the throne. One fascinating example, though, of this kind of talismanic technology, which is easily accessible if you go to Istanbul or if you go to a library, you can. There have been studies of these things. They're called talismanic shirts. Very, very interesting, and they're covered with these sorts of symbols, and they're not easy to make. They're made by hand. So there's several studies. There's at least 2 studies that I know of on talismanic shirts, but they're in Turkish. So the point is that this technology was widespread in the so-called, in the phrase of Marshall Hodgson, the gunpowder empires, the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mughals. So there was more to it than gunpowder, I suppose. And oddly enough, it seems that al-Buni himself was associated with an Ayyubid prince who would become al-Malik al-Salih, famous person in the dynastic history of Egypt. But what exactly is involved in these talismans? I mean, we have studies by Fleischer and so forth about, but what was really involved in actually making them, if you want. Surely people are curious how this was actually done. Well, if you want to understand it, there is a cosmology behind it. And al-Buni's cosmology is based on the well-known geocentric system, which has been known for most of humanity before Copernicus. But he differs somewhat in his incorporating the Arabic letters, the letters of the Arabic alphabet, into his system. And here also he has much in common with al-Buni. Now again, he and Ibn al-Arabi are not the first people to talk about the symbolism of the Arabic letters. There are predecessors. You find it in the Rasail of the Ikhwan al-Safa. You find, in terms of immediate historical antecedents to al-Buni and Ibn al-Arabi, you find people like Ibn Qasi, Ibn Barrajan, etc. And again, you find often a manifestly Shiite pedigree for this sort of esoterica. So, among the manuscripts which I consulted, about 8 of them deal with this Ptolemaic cosmology as the preamble to the book. And in fact, the shorter version of the Sun of Knowledge, the Shams al-Ma'arif, spells out this cosmology quite clearly. So we have a geocentric cosmos of concentric spheres. Its outermost realm is the alam, the world of the divine throne, al-arsh, followed by the realm, the alam of the divine pedestal, al-kursi, followed by the sphere of Saturn, which supports the sphere of Jupiter, which supports that of Mars, and so forth, all the way down until the moon. Then, of course, you have the sublunary sphere. Then you have the spheres of the various 4 elements, and of course, the motions of these spheres causes this agitation, which brings about alam al-kawni wal-fasad, the realm of generation and corruption. Al-Buni also associates with each of these planets, these kawakib in Arabic, a various awfaq. Awfaq is the term I prefer, but in English usually it's said magic square. Basically, it's a square array of numbers that sums up to the same constant, whether summed horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. And the smallest possible magic square is a 3 by 3. So the 3 by 3 is, so we have a 3 by 3, we have the 4 by 4, and so forth. And usually the 3 by 3 is associated with the moon, but sometimes it's associated with Saturn. So there are all of these different associations. And in these works also there is a conscious attempt to obfuscate and hide what is being presented. There are intentional mistakes in these manuscripts, and also in the earliest published editions and modern editions as well, to safeguard this knowledge and keep it occult, and also to protect people from harming themselves and others. So when al-Buni is writing about this, he will use terms which could be confused by someone. For example, he'll refer to the 3 by 3 as a muthallath. Now, muthallath in Arabic can mean triangle, but it can also refer to, it's not anything that has three associated with it. So he means, of course, a 3 by 3 square. But then, if he talks about a 7 by 7, he'll say musabba'. Now, someone might think, if they don't know, they might make the mistake of associating those words with the associated regular polygons. Thank you. Polygons, yes. So there's also a correspondence with the Arabic letters, and he has correspondences of certain Arabic letters with each of these 7 planets of the ancients. But he also, once you get into the sublunary realm, when we're talking about the moon is also, its motion is divided into these 28 lunar mansions, and this is something also very well studied phenomenon, in other systems. For example, in Vedic or Hindu astrology or astronomy, you have 27. Chinese have 28. But all it comes down to is dividing up that same 360 degrees in a certain way. And it's basically about 12 degrees, but we don't have to go into all of the math and all of this. But what is relevant for our purposes is that al-Buni says that each of these 28 mansions of the moon, each one is associated with a particular letter of the Arabic alphabet. So there are 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. And these mansions of the moon are mentioned in the Quran. In the famous Surah Yasin, chapter 36, says, وَالْقَمَرَ قَدَّرَنَاهُ مَنَازِلَ حَتَّى عَادَ كَالْعُرْجُونِ الْقَدِيمِ. So it's mentioned in the Quran as well. Now these 28 mansions of the moon then correspond with the letters of the alphabet. Furthermore, there is a one-to-one correspondence between numbers and the letters of the Arabic alphabet as well. And the way that works, I think I have a chart. So now we're finally going to use the computer here. Yes. This is how it works. This is a familiar system. You find a phenomenon like this kind of letter mysticism also in the Jewish Kabbalah. Of course, there it's somewhat different because you've got, 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and there's certain letters that are at the end, and then you put those all together and it works out. But in Arabic, since there's 28, it works out very nicely. So you have the ones, and then you have another sequence beginning with ya, which is over here. Then you get the tens, and then with qaf, you'll end up with the hundreds, and then you work through the hundreds, and ghain is 1,000. That is the system which is used in most of the Islamic world. In North Africa, there's a slightly different system. And strangely enough, in some manuscripts, and al-Buni was from North Africa, you find the Maghribi system or the North African system being used. So, another question for further research. This is not a talisman, what I'm bringing up on screen right now, but rather this is a diagram from the longer version or recension of the Shams al-Ma'arif, the Sun of Knowledge, which expresses what is in the shorter version, but in the form of a diagram. And so on the outside, the outermost, circle, you have the 28 mansions of the moon, the names of the mansion. Each one has a name. Then you've got the Arabic letters in the next circle. And then you have the 12 signs of the zodiac. So you can see where it says, it's spread across too, it says Haml in Arabic, that's Aries. And then it'll work all the way back, to the end of the list. Then you've got the names of the months according to the solar calendar that's used in, the older names like Ab and Elul and Tishrin and so forth. And you've got the seasons there as well. In the innermost circle, it would divide it into 4 quarters. I'm quite fond of this diagram. It's very well executed. So this is the whole symbolism that's involved. Now, al-Buni doesn't actually begin his discussion of these magic squares with the simplest magic square, which would be the 3x3 magic square, or wifq. But on the contrary, he begins with the 4x4 magic square. And this magic square he associates with the Arabic letter dal, which in that chart of numerical correspondences, alif, ba, jim, dal, it equals 4. Numerically, it corresponds to the number 4. Now, that's very interesting, because in the same passage, he then talks about how this is related to the 4 elements. So the letter dal, because it equals 4, it bears a symbolic association with the 4 elements of fire, earth, air, and water, as well as to the 4 natures of hot, dry, cold, and moist. So each letter of the Arabic alphabet then is associated with these, or has these, shall we say, elemental associations, and that is represented here. I don't know. Oh, you can see it better on this. I can't see it very well here. So interestingly enough, when you're making a talisman, you have to keep all of this in mind, because oftentimes a talisman will have, almost always, some sort of a magical square involved, often in the center. And so you have to construct it properly. So the numbers in each magic square may also be arranged according to 4 different sequences, also corresponding to the 4 elements. Now that's because certain cells in the square are associated with certain elements. There are certain elemental associations with the actual spaces in the grid which you would be filling in. Now, I didn't find, again, I'm not an expert on Western esotericism and magic, but it doesn't seem to be that distinction is there, at least in Agrippa, at least the translation that I have. It doesn't seem to, or maybe he's left it out, this occult knowledge, so maybe he's keeping that secret, I don't know. So if you do that, this is easier to see in a 3x3. These are the elemental associations of the 4 edge cells as opposed to corners in a 3x3 magic square. And on that basis, then, there are 3 ways or sequences whereby to fill the square. So if you start with 1 here, then you've got to put 2 down here. And of course, you could have the up to mirror reflection. So you would have it would still be based on fire. So this square is associated with the element fire, because the number 1 is at the top in the fire position. All right? That's air. Why? Because again, 1, and we don't have this, so here's air, right? So if you place the 1 here, which is the starting number, it'll be air. If you place it here, it'll be earth, and so forth. So you have the same you have a similar situation. It's actually a different situation with the 4x4. In the 3x3, you've got less things to work with. So either you go with these parts or you go with the corners. If you go with the corners, mathematically it won't work. That is just a mathematical truth. With the 4x4, it's far more versatile, and every cell has associated with it an elemental association. So if you start with the 1 here, it's fire. You start with it here, it'll be air, water, earth. Now, we're not going to go into all of the math, but what typically they would do is, let's say you have a 3x3. You want to make a magic square based on the divine name Allah. So you have to take alif, lam, and ha, because the word for God in Arabic has 4 letters. You have to add them all up. The answer is 66. And then you have to figure out how to encode 66 into that. And there are algorithms for this, and I've worked out all of the equations. I mean, I didn't do it. I'm not the first person to do it. This has been well known, but just as an exercise, I did it. And anyway, so you have to take the number 66, reduce it by 12, then divide it by 3. And that's not arbitrary. That's the only way to figure it out. And then you would begin, and you would put the first number that would result, for example, here, and then it would be according to the element of error. Well, how do you choose? Well, what you have to do is let's say you're making it for a person, right? So you have to take that person's name, and usually you take the mother's name as well. Figure out what the value is. You add them up, then you do another operation, and then you determine which element that name plus the mother's name corresponds to, and then you choose the appropriate square. Okay. So the 4x4, though, is much easier to work with, because what really happens is, a quick way to check is you could take any number, and if you want to find out if you can construct a 3x3, it's basically got to be divisible by 3, otherwise it won't work. If it's not, certain quotients, when you have a remainder, can be adjusted, but sometimes they cannot. And with a 4x4, you can almost always fix the problem. And so oftentimes the 4x4 would be employed in making talismans, especially if the talismans involve the divine names. Why? Because if you study this diagram in figure 4 very, very carefully, then you will find that the 4 elements are spread throughout the 16 cells in a very ingenious way. And so it's very, very balanced. And it's a much safer, they say, I don't really know, safer one to use than the 3x3 for talismans of this sort, especially those involving the divine name. So why don't you contemplate that for a while? And so the first talisman, which al-Buni actually talks about in the Sun of Knowledge, is associated with this whole discussion of the 4x4 magic square, because he's very interested in this whole notion of the 4 elements. And that also ties in with the letters of the Arabic alphabet, because 4 times 7 is 28. 7 is very important. Why? Because again, in the ancient Ptolemaic geocentric system, there are 7 planets, and to each planet corresponds a day, and the hours of the day are divided up according to planetary hours as well. And all of that also comes into play when making a talisman. So there's a vast web of associations and correspondences that has to be kept in mind when reading works like this. This isn't something you can sort of read on the tube, I mean, you have to sort of really think about it. And in pre-modern times, people read much more slowly than they do now. And especially if they were educated, they often read the same sorts of books. And because they lived in the manuscript age, they read slowly because manuscripts have problems. Any of us who work in manuscripts know this. And so they tended to read things slowly and carefully, unlike now. So that's really what you have to do when you're reading al-Buni, and you also have to keep a piece of scrap paper with you, and a calculator if you need one, or a slide rule or abacus, which is what I prefer, and to figure out what is going on. So al-Buni starts with this discussion of a 4x4 magic square. But then he says something very interesting. He says that, this is the basic form of the magic square, and he gives this the one that's associated with fire. Then he says, but you can construct another one, which is based on the letter dal. Well, how is that? Well, the Arabic letters can also be expanded. So if you have the letter, so if you had, like, for example, the English letter W, if you actually spelled out what it means, it would be D-O-U-B-L-E something. I don't know. Maybe just a U, right? And so what you do with dal is you expand it. So dal is dal, alif, lam. Then you add up what those letters are. So dal is 4, dal is 4, alif is 1 going in order, and lam is 30. You get 35. 35 is not divisible by 4. What are you going to do? Because you've got to fit it into a 4x4 magic square. And he doesn't really tell you what to do. He just says, well, here it is. And then you have to look carefully and you have to notice that he's adjusted the 13th cell. So here's the expansion. This is dal, alif, lam. You add that up. And the number 35, as I just said, can only be inscribed in a standard 4x4 square if the value in the 13th cell and values in the cells thereafter are each incremented by 1, like so. I've done it for you. Now the letter dal is also, and this is, I'm just paraphrasing Buni here. He goes on to tell us, that dal is also associated with the name Muhammad. Muhammad is the name of the messenger of God for Muslims, the final messenger of God, and his name also has kind of power associated with it, and blessing and barakah and so forth. Notice though, it consists of, in English it doesn't, it really takes a long time to write in English, and you've got to transliterate and whatnot. But in Arabic you can do it with a flick of a wrist without even lifting your pen once, and it consists of 4 letters, the mim, ha, mim, dal. Then there's also Ahmad, also 4 letters, also has a dal. Then there are the divine names Al-Wadud, also which have a dal, which has a dal in it twice, and the name Ad-Da'im, which also has a dal. Al-Buni specifically mentions these names. I didn't, choose them. Of course, when you work with these divine names, it's a well-known fact in this science that you usually cut off the definite article, which is the alif and lam. So he says that similar squares, basically, actually he only hints at it. He doesn't explicitly say that. He merely hints that similar squares based on these names, Ahmad, Muhammad, Al-Wadud, Ad-Da'im, may be inscribed as talismans as well. Okay. And one other form of making a talisman, especially if it has 4 letters, is to work out the values of those 4 letters so that they fit in the square somehow. And they end up writing it across the top horizontal row. That's mathematically sometimes more difficult to do, but it can be done. So now let's actually look at one of these actual talismans. So here's a talisman from al-Buni, and that's the manuscript details are there if you're interested in that sort of thing. And the full name of the book is Shams al-Ma'arif wa Lataif al-Awarif. Again, we're not going to get into all of these arguments about the title and so forth, but this is what it looks like. And you have the divine name Ad-Da'im or Ya Da'im, basically in the vocative form. In other words, O self ever subsisting, across here and across the top, and then on the side you have some other names and other phrases, but this is what's of interest. And you have some other divine names here. And notice you've got Dal written like this, and you've got this. What they're actually doing, which he doesn't say anywhere in the book, is that this is mimicking the shape of the letter Dal. This angle here is mimicking the shape of the letter Dal. There's another. I could show you if we had more time. If anyone's interested, I have them on my laptop. I can show you everything. There's another amulet based on the letter Alif, which is in the shape of an F. Now, an Alif in Arabic is just a line. It's a vertical stroke. It's the easiest letter to make. It's the first one everyone learns. And then there's one based on Jim. And Jim also, well, the shape of the Jim is the shape of the Jim. And so there is an amulet also that is based on the letter Jim, whose value is 3. And it makes a kind of shape like anyway. I don't have an image for that. But it is there in the manuscripts. So here's the same amulet from a different manuscript. Now notice it's made somewhat differently. And again, to confuse people, I don't know why he chose to confuse people this way, but I suppose you can choose whatever way if you want to confuse people. He made the square upside down. That's not a mistake. I didn't sort of click the wrong thing when I pasted it into this document. That's how it appears in the original. So if you were reading it, you would have to turn the manuscript over to get that. So the square there is upside down. This is also an important manuscript, Haji Salim Agha 528. Anyhow, now here it is in the, to my knowledge, the oldest published, I could be wrong, but I haven't found anything older than the Indian lithograph of 1291 Hijri. And you've got the same thing. Now, there are important differences between these, but they essentially have the same sort of basic shape. So you can look at those. Now, as I think it should be clear to you by now, such talismans can really only be executed if you have more than a trivial grasp of mathematics. Moreover, you also have to have more than a trivial grasp of astronomy, astrology, because these have to be executed at the proper hour. Now, in the time of al-Buni, this knowledge was, it wasn't exactly hidden, it was accessible, and usually people who were educated, they learned it. In those days, if you studied in a traditional Muslim seminary, that was part of the subject as well. You would learn math, you would learn mathematical astronomy, you would learn these things. And then even if you didn't know how to do the calculations, which of course would have been executed in those days using the iPhone of the time, of course, the astrolabe, you could, yes, and different astrolabes were different. They had different apps on them, just like we have today with our iPhones and iPads and whatnot. And so if you couldn't do that, you at least had to know how to consult a table, and that's what most people did. Most people, and even modern practicing astrologers, they can't do the calculations themselves. It's too hard. If you did that, you'll do one horoscope in your life, maybe. And so they did tables, and now they don't do tables, they have software. But in the end, you had to know something about it. So this is far from being some sort of a phenomenon of mere popular religion indulged in by these, these rustic fallahin, these farmers, in the Nile Delta or something like that. This was a science. If you want to say it's just a game, fine, but it is a game that has rules. So you might ask, well, how does it make that different from magic? I've made a distinction between magic and non-magic. It may look the same. It may appear that they're doing similar things, but they're not. Someone asked me to explain that to them, and that's what I said, and they didn't like it. So I said, well, it would be something like, it looks the same, but it's not. And it's like if we say that theurgy is magic, that's somewhat akin to the account of a cricket match by a baseball correspondent. And I like that example, but it's not mine. I stole that from Bernard Lewis, and heard that from him way back in the day. A very different sort of area of investigation than what we're dealing with now. So there are two games, right? They use these wooden sticks, and they have these round objects which they hit around, but it's very different in what's happening. All right. So the square, the magic square, which is in the center of the first talisman, and these are all examples of the first talisman. We're talking about the magic square at the center. In all of these examples, in these two manuscripts and the published version, these are the first one is incorrect, and that's also clearly intentional. I think we're almost out of time, so I don't want to push this any further, but suffice it to say that there were intentional mistakes, and these I could point out quite a few of them, and they can be, they can be solved based on a knowledge of mathematics. So just to conclude, what I would like to say is that when talking about this phenomenon in Islamic civilization or Islamicate civilization, we must distinguish it from magic. It was not a merely popular phenomenon. In fact, to actually do it, you had to have a fair amount of training. And that these works have intentional mistakes in them as well. But if you have some basic understanding of mathematics and, of course, knowledge of Arabic and so forth, these kinds of things can be understood, and these talismans can, in many cases, be reverse engineered. So I hope that you have gotten something out of this presentation. I appreciate your patience, and if there are any questions, I would be more than happy to deal with them now. Thank you.